I opened the door and found my life scattered on the stone step, 2 suitcases, a faded shawl, a mason jar with some coins rattling like tiny bells, and a note that read, in my son's neat, untroubled handwriting, "Sorry, Mom, no space for you. Who knocks a grandmother out of her own home like a stray cat?" I asked myself, as if asking would change the weather or the cruelty that had been delivered in ink. I stood on the threshold with the city's hum pressing at my back and the smell of rain rising from the pavement, and I realized then that the world could become a stranger in the span it takes to close a suitcase. They say life narrows until only essentials remain: a warm mug, a photograph, an old garment that smells like the hands that stitched it. My essentials had been laid out for me like evidence. My chipped mug, with its blue rim and the hairline crack I had patched with stubborn glances for 30 years, lay beside the mason jar, the jar I kept on the kitchen windowsill for loose coins, for the holy and humble purpose of visiting the grandchildren. The pearls, my mother's pearls, the small, imperfect circle of dignity I wore at funerals and baptisms, were not in their velvet box. Instead, there was a tiny wooden lockbox with the lid buttoned shut and no key. Someone had left me symbols and conditions. I had been away for 9 days. On April 5th, I'd taken the 4:30 p.m. coach to my sister's village for what I had told myself would be a brief, unremarkable visit: a cup of tea, a memory, a prayer. I had left my apartment in the neat neighborhood where my son lived, his apartment building really, with the usual admonition to him about not forgetting his scarf. He kissed my forehead at the door, the kind of kiss that belonged to a man who once received warmth without price. He seemed inordinately busy then, but busy people wear busyness like armor. I should have read behind it. When I came back, the marble floors of the foyer reflected chandeliers and polished shoes. The doorman bestowed upon me the practiced politeness of men who manage thresholds for a living. His eyes flicked at the suitcases and then away, as if looking at abandoned things made him complicit. Upstairs, the corridor smelled faintly of lemon polish and the practiced air of someone who expects guests of a certain kind. My son's apartment door was closed. There was no light. There was a softness to the silence that felt deliberate, rehearsed. I had raised him a long time ago, with hands that learned the economy of tenderness. I taught him how to keep promise and how to make tea, so the cup was neither too hot nor too heavy. I was the woman who saved coins in a mason jar, 1 rupee at a time, until their clinked music could buy bus fare or a small pleasure. I was the woman who kept pearls in a velvet box and a chipped mug for mornings. I had come to his house tonight thinking of nothing more treacherous than an extra cup of jasmine tea. Inside the mailbox, leaning against the wall, my name was written on a single legal envelope. Durable power of attorney, executed April 3rd. That date burned in my mind. The date was 2 days before the charity gala he had insisted. I attend months ago, and 6 days after I'd told him I would visit my sister. The envelope had a lawyer's embossed seal. The paper smelled faintly of stationery and something else, something like the smooth, dry odor of a lock closing. I stood there with my coins jingling in their jar and the pearls absent, and I felt something in my chest bend and snap in the kind of way that is not loud but catastrophic. I remembered the day, 3 months earlier, when he said he needed me to come to the bank to sign some forms. I had been proud then, in a private way, that he relied on me. The very thought that my son would call for help warmed the edges of my heart. We went at 11 in the morning on January 14th, clear and cold, and the banker had been a gentle man with spectacles that slid down his nose. He had told me about convenience and family affairs, and had slid a stack of papers across the desk like a magician revealing the wrong card. Did I suspect anything? No. My name, my signature, my trembling practice signature was my truth. Or so I thought. The note at my son's door did not ask. It announced. It rendered me instantly a foreigner. I wiped the rain off my shawl with the corner of my sleeve and felt foolishly naked, as if I had forgotten to put on the right shoes for the part I was supposed to play. Was this really my own child speaking to me? I asked the empty hall, and my voice sounded like a confession I'd been carrying to the altar. I did not know, then, that the mason jar would later become a relic of my good faith. that the chips in my mug would be read by others as evidence of neglect, and that the pearls would become a bargaining chip. But even then I felt the ledger of our lives tilt. I rang the bell. There was the sound of distant footsteps, of a lock turning in a slow, practiced way. My son opened the door and looked at me as if he had found a painting that didn't belong in his curated living room. Interest without recognition. He wore clothes that cost what my heart had taken years to earn in patience. There was a woman at his shoulder, a woman I had met only once at a family gathering, who smiled as if she had always known me even as she removed the warmth from her eyes. She was a neat sort of presence, the kind that arranges flowers by height and people by usefulness. "Mom," my son said, and the voice we had used for decades slid into his throat like a well-rehearsed line. I could tell he had practiced that single syllable carefully. It was both a greeting and an act of distance. "You should go." I laughed then, a small, startled sound that surprised me with its youth. "Go where?" I asked. "My key?" He held up his hand, the way a man will steady himself between two truths. "We had a talk. The apartment is complicated. There's no space." "I'm sorry, Mom, truly, but—" His hand hovered over his heart, and his eyes looked away toward the framed degrees on the wall, as if they contained the answer. I have a mother's memory and a grandmother's grit. I remember the night he was born, how I counted his fingers as if checking for all the futures he might hold. I remember borrowing money to buy his first sweater. I remember the mason jar I tucked into my pantry the winter he left for college, each coin a prayer I didn't think I needed to name. Had that memory been a crime? "Did you leave this?" I asked, nodding to the small lockbox on the step. I should have felt grateful for small things, but all gratitude that night tasted like ash. He shook his head. "We thought it might be better. You know how the building is. We have guests coming in and the pearls," I said, my voice lowering to something dangerous. "My mother's pearls?" He shrugged with the uninterested air of youth that has rediscovered patience in other people's pain. We kept what we thought was appropriate. The woman beside him smiled with the kind of sympathy you offer to strangers in televised tragedies. "It's just until," she said. "Until," I echoed. The word was a hinge. I entered the apartment because I had nowhere else to go that night and because the cold wanted me like a creditor. Inside, the place smelled of citrus cleaner and the faint perfume of the woman who arranged cushions like a diplomat. Photographs lined the mantel, images of my son in suits, in front of company logos, at events where champagne glasses clinked. In one, my son was laughing with a woman who could have been his future if futures were flowers. My own face was not in the frame, though I had lived inside 1,000 of his candid smiles. On his kitchen counter was an envelope stamped with a notary's seal. My name on it, durable power of attorney, it said. Dated April 3rd, 2 days before the gala he had hosted the previous month, where the silverware had been polished and my son had spoken about family values in a way that glittered. My hands, which had washed dishes for decades and tied school shirts and folded hospital gowns, trembled. I opened the envelope with the care of someone opening a grave. A document, crisp and official, lay inside. It bore my signature in my own careful slant. It bore, too, the notary's mark and a witness line with another name. One I recognized as the accountant who had once helped the family file taxes. The text said, in the blank, bureaucratic language of power, that I had granted my son authority over my financial affairs. It said, in the acid of the printed phrase, that I had ceded the right to act in my name to him. The phrase durable power of attorney glittered like an accusation. I had not, I thought. I had never signed such a thing. I had been to the bank on January 14th with him, true. But had I signed that? Was it an exchange of paper for trust? Was it a trap set with the soft ink of convenience? The document was dated April 3rd, 2 days before my arrival home, and my signature was on it. I remember the moment my throat closed. No, not the throat, but that ancient store of belief that had been the backbone of my life. Had I been foolish enough to hand over my liberty? Had my signature been stolen, or had my memory failed me like a worn servant? I felt my knees weaken. I sat on the edge of the kitchen chair, and the world was atilt. The woman looked at me with an expression that attempted sympathy, but had rehearsed every syllable. "There must be a misunderstanding," she said. "We'll sort it. We want you to be comfortable." Comfortable, I thought. In a world that had boxed my belongings and left them at a door like refuse. I rose, moving to the china cabinet where my son kept the glasses for guests whose lives were larger than mine. There, in the faint reflection of crystal, I saw the face of my son and the woman, a perfect duet. I wanted to shout, to throw the mason jar at the portrait and shatter the ease that had filled their mouths for years. Instead, my fingers closed around the chipped mug tucked behind a row of glasses. The crack in it had been patched mentally as if with a promise. Tonight, the crack was an indictment. I had kept letters, of course. Who wouldn't? A stack of thin envelopes tied with string lay in the bottom drawer of my bedside table. They were letters from years when my handwriting was young and my promises were currency. Wedding invitations. A note the doctor sent in 1999. The small annuity papers that promised a pension of about $230,000 if kept whole. About that. Numbers stick to the mind. I had tucked them away in case I needed proof of a life lived honestly. "Do you have somewhere to stay?" the woman asked, and the politeness in her voice was a net thrown over a river. "Yes," I said, because the truth was a small, honest thing I liked to release when the night felt big and dangerous. I always have somewhere to stay. But the truth is sometimes a light that reveals more than you planned. I left that night with the wooden lockbox in my hands. The pearls were not inside. The mason jar of coins fit neatly beside the chipped mug. I took them as if I were taking relics to some exile. The doorman watched me with the professional look of a man who had seen sorrow and packaged it into routine. "They said it's temporary," he offered, like a courier of consolation. The next morning, I sat on my sister's sagging sofa and read the letter my son had left on the step once more. His handwriting was careful. "Sorry, Mom, no space for you." No invitation, no offer to rectify, no arrangement, just a tidy sentence that separated us. The mason jar's coins sang against the wood like a small gong, as if marking a funeral. My sister brewed tea so strong it could argue with grief. "You should talk to a lawyer," she said, practical as a midwife. I had always told my children to be practical, but not at the expense of kindness. A week later, I learned the name of the lawyer who had notarized the paper, Ahmed Raza, of the firm Raza & Co. He was a man who kept appointments at 2 p.m. and wore cufflinks shaped like tiny ships. I remember the way his office smelled, of lemon oil and old books, the same smell as my son's foyer. When I called, his assistant said he was engaged, which is a polite way to say he was managing the affairs of people who believed themselves untouchable. I went to see him on April 20th, because dates give a chronology to justice, and I wanted numbers and witnesses. The receptionist was efficient. The assistant offered me water with the solemnity of a nurse. Mr. Raza received me with the slow, careful courtesy lawyers are paid for. "Mrs. Khan," he said, my married name, which I still used despite all that had been shed. The durable power of attorney is valid on its face. "Your signature," he tapped the document with the kind of gesture that punctuates decisions, "matches." It was signed April 3rd, witnessed by one Mr. Imran Asif, and notarized appropriately. It grants your son the authority to manage financial accounts, property transactions, and to act in your stead in matters of banking and assets. A door slammed somewhere inside my chest. For the first time in my life, I felt as if someone else had been appointed the clerk of my identity. "But I didn't sign that," I said, and the words fell like coins on a hard floor. He looked at me with the professional sorrow of a man who sells reason for a living. "If you contest it, we can examine the signatures, the witness attestations, and the notarial registry. But those procedures take time, and in the interim, acts taken under the instrument are presumed valid." Time. The word felt like an enemy. I left the office with my mason jar and my chipped mug and a mind that moved like a kitchen crowding with thoughts. The legal papers were now heavy with consequence. My son had not merely made a cruelty. He had assembled a bureaucracy around it, He had created illegal furniture to put me outside of my own life. I thought of the children he taught to say family values on stage, of the gala where he toasted charity, and of the woman who arranged cushions. I thought of the times I had set my hand to paper in good faith and had trusted that ink would honor me. How often does trust turn into ink that can be used against you? At the bottom of my heart, a small heat began to grow, not anger at first, but something ancestral, a slow, sharpened thing that had sat hidden under years of forgiving. It was the old knowledge that life balances, though not always on our schedule, and that debts are kept, one way or another. I had been a giver my whole life, and now it seemed the account had been closed without my signature. I tucked my pearls velvet box into my coat, though it was empty, as if carrying their absence might become a form of proof. I kept the mason jar under my arm like a child and the chipped mug against my hip. When the streets closed around me as night folded today, I felt the shape of what I had been and the unfamiliar architecture of what I might be becoming. I will not say I was immediate in rage. I am a woman who understands the slow art of patience. But even the patient have limits. The first of those edges had been crossed that night, and the second would come soon enough. I never expected what I would find in that drawer. Justice, like a slow tide, collects the proofs of pride before it reveals itself. They tell you that anger is loud and sudden. They are wrong. Mine came slow, like a kettle finding its patience and then shrieking, one small shriek at first, then a chorus. After the mason jar and the chipped mug and the note that said simply, "Sorry, Mom, no space for you," my life became a ledger of small indignities. Each one, when added, made a sum that could not be ignored. I began where sensible people begin when things that belong to them are taken, at the bank. On April 22nd, at precisely 10:15 a.m., I walked into Sunrise Bank branch code 007, clutching the envelope Mr. Raza had shown me and the memory of my own right hand forming letters on paper. The bank smelled of cold coffee and the faint ozone that comes from machines that count other people's fortunes. I asked for a copy of the transaction history on my account, and when the teller, Samar, a young man with a voice that suggested he had practiced politeness in the mirror, hesitated, I produced a photograph, that old stubborn thing that proves presence, a picture of my hand writing a recipe, my hand in the same light that bathed the stamped paper. "We need written authorization," he said, a phrase designed to be kind to the dishonest. "Authorization?" I repeated. "I am the account holder, and the durable. Power of attorney dated April 3rd names Mr. Khan as authorized." He said the name like a prescription that did not belong to me. I watched his face, for cracks like a woman who has long learned to read porcelain. At last, Samar leaned forward. "Madam," he said, "there is a notation of a transfer. 3 wire transfers on April 4th, on 6th, and 9th. Amounts totaling about $230,000 were moved into a corporate holding account under Khan Holdings. Account number ending 9421. Those numbers became the drumbeat in my head. $230,000. The sum was round as a coin and terrifying as a decree. The bank said it had been moved for investment. They said the transfers were authorized under the durable power of attorney. The paper I had been handed at my son's door had legs. I left the bank knowing the shape of the problem. The money was gone. The instrument that moved it wore my name. But I had never been the sort to accept a garment that did not fit. The instrument could be challenged. Signatures could be questioned. Witnesses could be compelled to speak. I put the mason jar in my purse like an amulet and set out to collect the witnesses. My first stop was the small apartment on Gulshan Road where the accountant, Imran Asif, lived. He had been listed as a witness on the document that, so my son and his cohort declared, bore my signature. Imran answered the door in slippers and a sweater his wife had knitted for him the year of the floods. He had the easy, sheepish guilt of a man who tries to do small favors and ends up in the margin of someone else's crime. "Imran," I said, and he recognized my voice because I had once given him tea on late nights when he worked through ledgers for clients who believed in tidy books. He invited me in without preamble. On a wooden shelf behind him sat a stack of folders labeled with the names of corporations he served. I sat on his narrow sofa and watched him fumble with a packet of biscuits as if handling evidence. Mrs. Khan, he said. I didn't know what I was signing. He looked like a man who would have signed anything for the promise of an evening's peace. Ahmed Raza came by with the paperwork. He said it was routine, some family consolidation. His voice broke on the word family. He said Mrs. Khan was out of town but had authorized electronically. He frowned. He showed me a signed sheet. It looked like your signature, but faster, like when you sign knowing where the pen will end. Imran's fear was a thing that could be shaped into testimony. He told me that he had been instructed to be a witness and that he had not watched the signing himself. He had only initialed a witness line to confirm presence. I can swear that I did not see you sign, he said, but I can testify to the dates on which these papers were brought to me. That was not as much as I wanted. It was more than I had expected. I left Imran with the understanding that he would make a written affidavit if I asked. My next ally came where allies often come, from the edges. Mrs. Mahmood, the building's cleaning lady, had been present on April 3rd, sweeping the marble floors while the lawyers and accountants had pretended to consult the ghosts of legal protocol. She remembered a short, serious man in a dark suit and a woman with red nails, a man she thought had been brought in to help the old lady sign upstairs. Red nails? I asked. Are you sure? Yes, bright like rent bills, she said, and her simile made me laugh despite myself. They were angry, those people. They hushed the doorman. Said they needed privacy. Privacy. It sounded like a blind. They had closed the doors for secrecy. I began to understand the composition of the conspiracy. Ahmed Raza, the notary whose name I had heard in that lemon-scented office, was a hub. Imran Asif, the accountant, was a man tempted by a favor that had come in a folder. And Mr. Khan, my son, was the architect. Each had a role as clean as a stage direction. I hired a lawyer who did not look like the ones my son chose. A retired judge, Mr. Tariq, who now took pro bono cases for the sake of the next breath of justice. He had been a magistrate for 30 years and held the law like a candle in a tempest. When I walked into his office, time felt measured by the amount of dust on the bookshelf and the patience in his hands. You understand what's at stake, Mrs. Khan? He asked, and his voice was not kind because he had learned that kindness often makes mischief easier. I understand, I said, and that was the truth. The durable power of attorney, signed April 3rd, transfers April 4th, 6th, and 9th, $230,000 moved into Khan Holdings. He steepled his fingers. We can do a few things. First, an affidavit of forgery must be prepared. We will engage a forensic document examiner to compare your known signatures to the April 3rd instrument. We will subpoena the notarial registry. There is a notarial registry entry number 4521, I suspect, for that date, and request CCTV footage from the bank and Mr. Raza's office. If we can show manipulation or an absence of your physical presence at the signing, we can seek an ex parte temporary restraining order to freeze assets and then file for an injunction. Legal language is a kind of armor. It made me feel armed. How long? I asked. Procedures of this nature can take from days to months. For an ex parte order, we need immediate probable cause. For the forensic report, expect 3 to 5 business days after receipt. He folded his hands. And in that motion lay the quiet calculation of a man who has seen the outcomes of haste and delay. We set the wheels in motion. The forensic examiner arrived, a woman named Dr. Farida Siddiqui, who had once been dismissed in courtrooms for her frankness and later redeemed by the precision of her science. She placed the April 3rd instrument under a lens and then asked me to produce samples of my signature, old bank forms from 1999, letters to my sister, the recipe I used to sign my name to. She worked with microscopes and the patient language of craft. This signature, she told me finally, pointing to a flourish in the April 3rd document, shows the pressure patterns inconsistent with your known samples. The stroke sequence is different. There are indications of hesitation in parts where your signatures flow. It is consistent with a traced signature or a simulation. My chest expanded with a bitter, hot air. So, she said, we have probable evidence of forgery. I remember the precise sound the word made, not the final clang of verdict, but the sound of a bell that begins the march. By April 27th, Mr. Tariq had obtained the ex parte temporary restraining order, the court document listed as civil suit, Nome 2025 CV an 1847, which froze transfers from my accounts and prevented Mr. Khan from disposing of assets pending further trial. It was an unsent victory, a legal leash around a man who had thought himself free. But law is not the same as theater. To put ink on a page and expect conscience to follow is naive. Men who make their lives in the currency of convenience do not easily surrender. While the court held its balance, my son recalibrated his tactics. One evening in early May, as I sat with the mason jar on my lap and the pearls, still absent, tucked in an inner pocket of my coat, I received a phone call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was familiar. It was the soft, smooth cadence of Ahmed Raza. "Mrs. Khan," he said, with the coolness of a man who has already decided you are a storm passing through his corridor. "Do reconsider. This is messy for everyone. You must let some things go." "I have let go all my life," I said. "I cannot let this." There was a pause, the measured silence of those who think they hold the advantage. "Your son is stressed," Raza continued. "These are delicate matters of family. He is popular in the charity circles. He has obligations." "Obligations cannot be paid with someone else's signature," I replied. "They cannot be paid with a borrowed name." He laughed softly, the sound of a man who does not use laughter to mask fear, but to gild it. "This will not be good for you. Threats wrapped in courtesy are the worst kind. They are like a hand that smooths a shirt before it pushes. You out into the rain, I would not be bullied by a man in cufflinks shaped like ships." It was around this time that I learned of the gala. April 5th had been the date of a coach to my sister. April 3rd, the day of the forgery. April 28th was the gala's anniversary in the public mind. But the company event was scheduled for May 3rd, the same event he had mentioned when my durable power of attorney had been dated 2 days earlier. My son had been in the news that week, speaking of philanthropy and family integrity. He had cultivated an image. He was the man who spoke of charity at 5-star dinners and family in cut-glass toasts. The moral dissonance would be delicious if exposed. We planned thus. While the court froze the accounts, I would collect the non-legal evidence that had a way of shaming men who believed only in legal instruments and not in the court of public opinion. My allies included a former bank officer named Nadim, who had been moved by Samar's reluctance to deny me the CCTV footage. He smuggled a copy of the bank's security tape for April 3rd at 3:12 p.m., when Mr. Raza claimed he had notarized documents in his office. The tape, grainy but telling, showed a dark-suited man entering the banking hall, followed by a woman with striking red nails. The camera angle caught the reception desk, but not the interior of Mr. Raza's office. It was but a piece. Yet it was at the bank's back office, where records are kept and secrets sometimes sleep, that Nadim found more. A maintenance log showed that the bank's CCTV for the interior of the notary area had been offline for 2 hours that afternoon due to an unplanned system update scheduled at 2:45 p.m. The log, however, bore the maintenance engineer's initials in a hand that did not belong to the person whose name was printed there. A trivial detail? Perhaps. Triviality is where conspiracies begin. I remembered what my mother used to say: "A liar leaves a footstep he forgets to wash." Little traces remain. At the same time, we subpoenaed Mr. Raza's notarial registry. Entry number 4521. Mr. Raza, under oath, declared that the document had been presented for notarial acknowledgement and that he had witnessed the signing in his office. He produced an entry stamp, Notarial Registry Entry number 4521, April 3rd, 2025, 3:05 p.m., notarized by Ahmed Raza, signature present. But the forensic expert had already examined the registry stamp and found that the ink used was a different batch than one used in previous months, a small chemical variance that betrayed tampering. When confronted with this, Mr. Raza's smile thinned. He said in a tone he thought measured that he had been busy that day and might have recorded entries later. "Administrative errors happen," he said. "We are only human." Humans, I thought, who make whole policy rooms into instruments of convenience. By May 8th, we had assembled a mosaic of small facts: a handwriting analysis pointing to forgery, a maintenance log suggesting a CCTV blind spot, the bank transfers, Imran's shaky witness status, and a pattern of evasions from Mr. Raza. Each piece alone might be noise. Together they formed a melody, and melodies have the habit of becoming songs that people remember. I had moved from being merely a plaintiff to being someone who would not be quiet. The decision was not instant, but it was absolute. I recall sitting up one night, the mason jar beside the bed like a small church bell, and thinking of the ways I had taught my children to stand. I thought of how my son had clasped my hand as a child and promised the moon. He had never returned it. There is a law older than the law of men. What you build on others' surrender cannot endure. That truth comforts when courts drag their feet. We planned a strategy that required patience and a touch of theater. The gala, where my son would surely bask in the applause he had bought with speeches, provided the stage. On May 3rd, he would be in front of an audience of donors, cameras, and civic pride. We would not ambush him with legal filings alone. We would present evidence to the people who mattered to him: public trustees, charity boards, and journalists who valued contradiction. To do this, we needed one last hinge, a witness who could say, simply and unmistakably, that there had been a process of entrapping me. That witness was the maintenance engineer, Farouk, who had been instructed to take the cameras down for a fake update. Farouk had been frightened. Ahmed Raza had told him the update was for security. Farouk had not known he would become a part of a forgery. When my lawyer assured him that his testimony would be protected, he agreed to come forward. He spoke in the court's vestibule on May 1st, his hands still trembling with guilt. They asked me to disable the interior camera while they brought the documents in, he said. I was told it was to preserve confidentiality. He could not say the word forgery at first. The truth had been heavy for him. When he did say it, the sound of it in the corridor was like a bell. We had the maintenance log, Farouk's statement, the forensic analysis, Imran's affidavit that he had not witnessed the signing, and the bank transaction records. The court took these with the seriousness of a man who knows a reputation's threads can be pulled out. An emergency hearing was set for May 4th, and the judge, who had once taught at the university and now preferred the slow heat of justice to the bright light of fame, listened. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Mr. Khan's lawyers argued technicalities: chain of custody, the proper execution of the notarial registry, and the presumption of regularity. Mr. Raza's posture was that of a man who has learned how to wear confidence as a coat. They were good. They had money and habit and a willingness to confuse the issue. But small truths have a clarity money cannot buy. Dr. Farida's testimony was surgical. She showed magnified images of strokes, how a stroke trembles when copied and flows when born from practice. She contrasted my signature on household documents with the April 3rd signature and explained the differences in pressure and rhythm. The judge, a man who had seen signatures tested before, sat up with interest when she mentioned micro-hesitations consistent with tracing. Farouk's admission that an interior camera had been disabled created a gap where action had been hidden. Nadim, the former bank officer, quietly presented the bank's internal maintenance correspondence, showing an irregularity with the scheduled update. When the judge adjourned, he issued an interim order requiring Mr. Khan to return $150,000 of the transferred funds into escrow pending a full hearing, an amount he considered sufficient to prevent irreparable transfer and to preserve assets. It was not all of the money, but it was something. The court docket read, Civil Suit Number 2025 CV 1847, Interim Order dated May 5, 2025, Return of Funds to Escrow. Hearing scheduled May 20th. My son's face, when I saw him after the hearing, had been remade by worry. He had the odd look of a man who discovers that his reflection might no longer flatter him. He tried the old gestures, soft words, promises of dinner, but I could not be mollified by things that were now evidently arranged in theaters. I was walking home that evening when I overheard him on a balcony, speaking on a phone with the woman with red nails. He did not know I could hear. His voice was low, urgent. They have the funds in escrow, he said. They can't touch the rest if the judge freezes it. We need a plan. Have Raza talk to the trustee. Delay any further transfers. There was a cold efficiency in the way he spoke of the money, as if these were variables on a ledger rather than the sweat of a life. I stood there as the evening gathered its shadows, and I felt something old and fierce stir. The turning point had arrived. I had proof of forgery. I had court orders and affidavits. I had the bank's own log and a man who would admit to disabling the cameras. But evidence in court is an argument. The moral damage my son had dealt me required more than ink. It required the restoration of public regard. I would not be satisfied with a partial victory within a bench of wood and robes. I wanted the music of truth to reach the ears that applauded him. I wanted him to feel the public sting. There is, I thought, a moral harmony. A man who builds a house on other people's inheritance will find the doors open to wind. He who confuses convenience with right will one day meet the ledger of consequence. We planned the next act as if it were a scene in one of the old plays I had loved as a girl. 1 part legal, 1 part theater. On May 3rd, the gala would begin at 8 p.m. at the Pearl Hall. Cameras would be present. The judge's interim order and the forensic report were to be made available to 2 journalists whom we trusted to tell the truth. I would not drag my life into public for sport. But there are moments when a private wound cries out for public witness. On the morning of May 3rd, as I dressed, I slid the empty velvet box for the pearls into my bag. It was a symbol I would use if necessary. I wore my chipped mug's memory like armor, and the mason jar, oh, the mason jar, sat in my bag like a relic. I arrived early at the Pearl Hall. The lights were not yet set. The tables waited like islands in a low sea. My son moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who believed networks could replace roots. He greeted donors and posed for photos. He was radiant in a way that made me ache, radiant with a borrowed light. I watched him, thinking of the small boy who used to chase pigeons in the courtyard, the boy who would sit on my lap and listen to stories I told in a voice that was slow and warm. I had told him stories of justice as if they were lullabies. He had apparently decided that stories were for children. At 8:30 p.m., as the gala's proceedings began and the orchestra tuned its instruments, I felt the air thicken. A man from the paper I trusted, a woman from the local television network, and Mr. Tariq sat near me, their faces set. Dr. Farida sat with her briefcase as if it contained thunder. The plan was simple. When my son took the stage to speak, our lawyer would stand and request a moment to address the press. We would present the forensic report and the ex parte order. The room would be forced to listen, to reconcile the image with the fact. My heart kept a steady beat, the kind that steadies one for action. I had not understood, in those first hours after the note and the mason jar, that destiny could be navigated by small, deliberate movements. He was up to speak. He took the stage at exactly 9:12 p.m., the chandelier catching in his hair. He spoke about family and philanthropic duty, and the applause was thick as honey. Then, as he reached the part of his speech where he thanked those who stood by me, the lights flickered. A technical interruption, they said at first. Someone had tripped a breaker. But real interruptions are not random. Ours was directed. Mr. Tariq rose in the audience and, with the court's interim order in his hand, asked for a moment to address the assembly. The orchestra fell silent, leaving the air like a held breath. A murmur rippled. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Tariq said, and he spoke with the calm of someone reading a summons. "This is civil suit number 2025 CV 1847. An interim order has been issued to preserve assets." My son turned toward us. His face the color of someone who sees smoke from a distance and recognizes the reality. "This is a private matter," he said, attempting to reclaim the public stage. "Perhaps," Mr. Tariq continued, "but when philanthropy is spoken of publicly, while private acts of forgery and conversion occur, citizens deserve the truth. We have forensic evidence indicating that a durable power of attorney dated April 3rd was likely forged. We have testimony that a CCTV feed was disabled. We have bank records showing significant transfers. The crowd's reaction was a tide. Camera lenses swiveled. The woman with red nails had become a blur backstage. My son's jaw tightened as if he had been struck. He left the stage before the murmurs could become a roar. I watched him go, and I felt a curious thing. I was not the same woman who had stood on his step with her life in 2 suitcases. The decision to fight had reshaped me into someone else, not vengeful for its own sake, but resolute. This is where the turning point became absolute. I had uncovered what I needed. The choice now was no longer whether to fight, but how to expose and to let justice follow. I was leaving the hall when my phone buzzed. The message was brief and blunt. We can make this go away. Meet in the service corridor in 10 minutes. A.R. Ahmed Raza had the audacity to ask for a private meeting after we had called him into the light. I felt my blood thrumming with a new clarity. I would meet him, yes, but not to negotiate my silence. I would let him speak his own undoing. I stepped into the corridor, the chandelier's light dimming behind me, and there he was, cufflinks like tiny ships, and a smile that had weathered many storms because it had been paid to. "Mrs. Khan," he said, with that little courtesy, "let us speak as adults." "Adults who forge signatures?" I replied, and the words were slow and precise, like placing tiles in a pattern. He said nothing at first. For a moment I thought he might order security. Instead, he offered the sort of reasoning that men often offer when they are running a scheme they believe is clever. "You must understand," he said, "your son's businesses are at risk." He required liquidity. The instrument was a measure to secure family continuity. "It is not uncommon." "Not uncommon," I echoed, thinking of mothers who sew up children's shirts by hand and do not drag the stitches into public markets. To steal from the living for the sake of convenience? He smiled thinly. "I can arrange a reconciliation. Return some funds, sign an agreement for your maintenance. No scandal. No scandal?" I laughed then, because the idea was absurd. There is already scandal. The scandal is not what you fear. It is what you have created. For several tense minutes we parried in the corridor, words like short knives. I recorded the exchange on my phone with the app that Mr. Tariq's team had recommended. Evidence preserves itself best when the voice of a liar betrays itself. Raza's voice had the practiced calm of someone who believes in plausible deniability. "You should be careful," he said finally. "This goes deeper than you think. And you," I said, "should be careful about thinking I am the sort of woman who will be bought." He left as quickly as he had come, his steps measured, his trail of cologne dissipating in the dark. The recording on my phone was a jewel. It captured his attempt to rationalize and, crucially, his mention of the trustee, the man who could be persuaded to accept funds if properly guided. It would be an important bead on the chain. As I walked back into the gala's glow, the world felt different. The evidence had multiplied. The public was watching. The law had been moved into motion. My son had been nudged out from his comfortable illusion of immunity. We had reached the climax of our ascent toward truth. And then, as I placed my hand in my bag to make sure the mason jar was still there, small comforts hold us upright. The lights in the hall shut down completely and all the screens went black. The lights went out and the world became a black bowl that held only sound, the rustle of a dress, the distant clink of a glass, a soft curse from a man who felt his image slipping like a silk glove off a guilty hand. For an instant I stood in that darkness and felt my whole life gather like a shawl around my shoulders, threaded with small kindnesses and the stubborn patches of survival. Then the emergency lights hummed, the screens blinked, and the microphones caught the hush that follows truth when it is allowed to speak. I walked toward the corridor where Mr. Raza's voice had tried to arrange my silence. The recording I had made on my phone was a warm, ordinary thing, 2 minutes and 23 seconds of cotton calm and confession. I played it softly for Mr. Tariq and the journalist from Dawn who had come to cover the gala interruption. Raza's elevator-smooth voice unspooled motives and names. The trustee, a temporary arrangement, ways to manage the company's liquidity. When the journalist's eyes widened, I tasted something like vindication. The day after the gala, the papers carried a headline that felt like a small, slow drumbeat. Forgery claims rock charity gala. My son's name was on the page with the precision of a surgeon's incision. The journalists were careful to note that nothing was final, that the law moves slowly and must be respected. But the court moves on evidence and reputation moves on gossip. Both had begun to turn. There is a peculiar calm in the eye of consequence. After the storm, people tidy themselves and look for explanations. I went home with the mason jar in my bag and a strange lightness in my chest. The mason jar, that humble clatter of coins, had become a symbol of the life I would not give up. The pearls, still absent, a question with a weight. I set the jar on the kitchen table and poured tea. The steam rose like a small white flag. We had the interim order, civil suit number 2025 CV 1847, dated May 5, 2025, requiring that $150,000 be returned to escrow, and the forensic report indicating probable forgery. Yet the ledger did not balance on words alone. There was the remaining $80,000, still in Kahn Holdings' corporate account, a remainder my son and his co-conspirators would not relinquish without a struggle. I remember the day before the full hearing, May 19th. The city smelled of impending rain and street vendors sold samosas from steam like little fragrant promises. I sat in Mr. Tariq's office with my lawyer's face close to the map of possible motions. We can secure a temporary injunction to force disclosure of the trustee's communications and to compel Imran Asif's sworn testimony, he said. We can also petition for a criminal investigation into fraud and forgery, if the prosecutor finds probable cause. Do it, I said. And when a grandmother uses 2 words in this voice, the world tends to listen. There are moments when tenderness must delay, so justice may proceed. Micro cliffhanger. I found a new note in my mailbox. The note was not from my son. It was from his trustee, a man named Farid Malik, who managed several of Kahn Holdings' trust accounts. The handwriting was neat, mechanical, as if composed on a typewriter of caution. Mrs. Kahn, it read, let us meet on May 20th at 10 a.m. at the trustee office. We can resolve matters quietly. The arrogance. I had no intention of private negotiations that erased truth. I told Mr. Tariq, who smiled like a man who had learned how not to be surprised by audacity. He filed the motion for disclosure and copied the prosecutor's office. When the morning of May 20th came, the courtroom smelled of new paper and coffee and the expectation of finality. The hearing began at 10 a.m. sharp. The bench was filled with the quiet authority of a judge who had once taught contracts and had the patience of someone who knows deceit smells worse than ordinary. Mismanagement. Mr. Tariq laid out the narrative with the care of a storyteller. He presented the forensic analysis, Farouk's maintenance affidavit, the bank's internal logs, Nadim's CCTV copy, and my son's phone records. The prosecutor, whose name was Aisha Khan, no relation, listened with the professional cool of someone who measures each piece against a higher standard. The defense strained to present the document as an act of family convenience. They argued for presumption of regularity, for the sanctity of notarized instruments. But there is a difference between what is regular and what is righteous. The judge leaned forward when Dr. Farida explained the tremor patterns in the disputed signature, and when Farouk described the moment, he had been asked to pull the camera for confidentiality. The sound in the courtroom was the slow gravity of truth being weighed. At noon, Mr. Farid Malik, the trustee, was called to the stand. He arrived with a face that had admired blandness and a suit that used to think it was important. Under questioning, he attempted to maintain the edicts of fiduciary calm. I received the funds as an authorized transfer, he said. Trust accounts receive capital for operations. Were you in communication with Mr. Khan on April 4th? Mr. Tariq asked. There was a pause like a held breath. Yes, Mr. Malik admitted. There were consultations about liquidity. But did you provide any instructions to receive funds without independent verification of the power of attorney? Mr. Tariq asked, and he asked it as you might ask a man if he remembered watering the roots of a tree whose trunk he had once admired. Mr. Malik's posture changed. He stuttered. He had allowed convenience to sweep aside caution. It is a common folly among men who mistake efficiency for virtue. There was a sense of urgency, he said. Mr. Khan assured me this instrument was in order. Did you ever speak with Mrs. Khan directly to verify her signature? The prosecutor pressed. No, he admitted. There in the courtroom, the trustee's small, soft admissions were like thread pulled from a seam that would not hold. The judge's face did not soften. He dismissed the defense's motions to quash evidence and set a schedule for restitution. The hint of a criminal referral was in the air. Fraud and forgery are not merely civil stains, they are criminal marks that rest heavy on a man's public regard. Micro cliffhanger. The pearls were closer than I thought. While the court did its slow, deliberate work, Mr. Tariq and I followed other channels. We searched for the pearls, for the velvet box bearing my mother's name. Strings of fortune often tangle. 2 days after the hearing, a call came from Nadim at the bank. He had discovered, in the account activity of Khan Holdings, a small, solitary transfer of funds to an individual named Shafi Textiles on April 10th, a modest sum of $1,250, the sort of amount used to buy quick, disposable items. Yet within the same dates, a known pawnbroker in Sadar reported a small transaction, the sale of a pearl necklace, 11 pearls, to Shafi Textiles on April 11th. I had imagined in private nights that my pearls would be sold in a quiet, regretful act. The idea that they would enter a petty market for convenience injured me as a woman who had used them like a covenant. I called the pawnbroker with the calm of someone who knows the texture of pearls when she pronounces their names. The man admitted, grudgingly, and with the greed of someone who knew he had little honor to lose, that he had the pearls and they were stored in a locked case, serial number 7810, and that they had been pawned by a woman who refused to give her full name. There are ways of tracing a small crime. Tracking small money sometimes leads to large truth. Mr. Tariq set a legal trap with a subpoena for Shafi Textiles receipts and for the pawnbroker's records. On May 25th, the records were produced, names, times, a photograph of the buyer taken by CCTV the day the necklace had been turned in. In the photo, the buyer's face was partially hidden, but the posture, the jacket, the small scar on the left cheek, details can be a cartographer of deceit. We circulated the images discreetly. A cousin of the woman with red nails, a young woman who had been employed by the same events company, recognized the posture of the buyer as that of Saima, the woman who had been present at my son's apartment the night I returned. Saima, when questioned, broke. She had been paid a small fee to pawn the pearls and had been told she would receive more later. She pointed a shaking finger toward a man named Imran, my accountant witness, saying he had been the one who gave her the money and the instructions. The chain narrowed into something very human. Small greed, fear, and the desire to please. Imran had been tempted by the implication of favor. Saima had been tempted by the lure of quick cash. A house of many rooms can fall by the carelessness of a single servant. We presented these findings to the court as circumstantial but powerful evidence. The judge, seeing the trail, bank transfers, a pawn ticket, a grainy photograph, ordered the pawnbroker to return the pearls to the court's custody pending a determination. On June 1st, a small velvet box was opened in a room with 2 lawyers and me, and inside lay 11 imperfect pearls that smelled faintly of vinegar and the small oils of commerce. They were not as luminous as in memory. They had been handled, pressed to light by greedy fingers. But they were mine. When the velvet lid lifted, I felt the old hand of my mother close over mine in memory. The pearls fit into my palm like the small patient proof of continuity. I held them to my throat and felt, in a way that courts cannot measure, a repair. Micro cliffhanger. My son's position would soon be empty. Public pressure accumulated like water behind a dam. Donors began to whisper, boards began to question, and managers who had once been content to stand close to my son started to distance themselves. By June 10th, Khan Holdings Board had convened an emergency meeting. The trustee, who had once thought himself a neutral steward, now had to contend with donors who wanted clarity. Several board members resigned to preserve the organization's integrity, an elegant phrase for retreat in the face of heat. My son, who had once been greeted with applause at 5-star events, found the rooms colder. He tried to maintain the language of regret, soft emails, carefully worded apologies. But those who had once encouraged him with platitudes found themselves in need of more than that. He tendered his resignation from the chairmanship on June 15th, less because of contrition, more because the world had tightened around consequence. In the end, the judge's ruling came on June 28th. It was detailed and deliberate, a finding that the April 3rd durable power of attorney bore significant indicia of forgery, that the transfer of $230,000 constituted conversion in part, and that the trustee had erred in accepting funds without independent verification. Civil suit number 2025 to CV for 1847 concluded with the order that Kahn Holdings return the remaining $80,000 to the plaintiff's account, that restitution be made for damages, and that a criminal referral be made to the prosecutor for further investigation into forgery and fraud. The judge sentenced the matter to a criminal preliminary inquiry and set bail conditions for those implicated. I stood outside the courthouse when the papers were released. The city air tasted like new pages. My son's face, when it came into view, was a map of what happens to men who are stripped of applause, embarrassed, angry, and small in a way that has nothing to do with stature and everything to do with having to face oneself. Dumas once wrote that revenge is a fruit that is sweetest when ripened by time and tempered by justice. I felt in that moment that the fruit I had once imagined would be bitter had become something else, closure tempered by the weight of truth. The grandeur of justice is not spectacle. It is a slow, inexorable separation of right from wrong. Micro cliffhanger. There was one last secret left to unearth. You will ask, what of the relationship? Did a court judgment stitch a wound that family had torn? The law can repair property and award costs, but the fragile currency of love is harder to restore. I had wanted not humiliation but acknowledgement. I had wanted not to take my son's life from him, but to take back what he had taken from me. The final act unfolded in a modest room rather than under chandeliers. My son came to my sister's house on a rainy afternoon, the same house where I had drunk tea after the first exile. He carried a small envelope in the kind of nervousness a man shows when he enters a church uninvited. I made him sit. The mason jar was on the table between us. The pearls lay in their box like small, patient moons. He spoke first, stumbling over apologies. He began, and the voice that had once patted scars like applause revealed its thinness. He tried to explain greed and fear, the pressure of investors, the arrogance of believing image could stand in for virtue. He used the language of men who think explanations are exits. I was trying to protect what we built? Protect? I asked, not unkindly, but with the steady logic of a woman who has handled pots and promised soup to hungry mouths. Did you think to protect my dignity? He hung his head. Tears, real and sharp, came, not like theatrical sprinkling, but like rain that has soaked the soil long enough to root something new. He offered restitution beyond the court's orders. He pledged to attend counseling and community service. He attempted to place the pearls on my hand, but I stopped him. It was not the pearls I wanted placed back upon me as a token. It was a recognition. Why? I asked simply. Why did you not call me? Why did you not speak? He spoke of shame and ambition, of fearing my disapproval more than my help. It is a peculiar shame to hide a wrong from the person whose hands would have steadied you and who had always been ready to sew torn hems. He had chosen image over honesty. For a long while we sat in that small room with the rain tracking the window pane. It would be a lie to say that everything was healed in one afternoon. Scars remain, and some doors, once closed sharply, do not swing open with comfort. But he stayed. He came often. He volunteered honestly in the charity programs he had once used for optics. He spoke at public forums about accountability and philanthropy and corporate governance, the kind of courage that must be learned in public. Dumas, like moral aside. Great crimes are often dressed in small conveniences. The kindest garment may hide the sharpest blade. When men trade conscience for comfort, the ledger of life remembers. There was poetic justice, yes, and there was consequence. Mr. Raza lost his notarial license after an inquiry found prosecutable irregularities. Imran Asif pleaded guilty to perjury and received a suspended sentence with mandated community service. Farid Malik was censured by his professional association and ordered to return to best practices. Saima received leniency in exchange for testimony. She had been a small foot in a larger shoe. My son's public roles were diminished. He paid restitution and agreed to a period of probationary oversight at a community fund. The criminal inquiry lingered, as these things must. For the law moves like a slow river, but the surface had been cleared. I reclaimed the bank accounts and, with the returned funds, established a small trust in my name to ensure my independence, an arrangement the court recorded in its final order. The creation of a protective trust for the plaintiff, ensuring that Mrs. Khan's pension and assets would be administered by an independent trustee approved by the court. It was not revenge in the cartoonish sense. It was a practical measure to prevent repetition. And yet, in the quiet domestic way I had always preferred, I did something more. I gave the mason jar to my granddaughter, a small girl with a laugh like a bell and a curious brow. I told her the story of the jar, how coins saved for kindness could be the armor of simple lives. I told her that names and signatures are not merely ink, but promises. The pearls, when I wore them again, felt heavier and truer against my throat. They were not the same as the ones I had tucked away in youth. Years and hands have their effects, but when I clasped them, I felt a continuity that no legal form could erase, the memory of a mother who had loved, the evidence of a woman who had not been willing to be erased. People would later ask if I felt vindictive. I answered always that my intent had been neither spite nor exhibition. It was the quiet repairing of a life, Dumas-like moral aside before final confrontation. When truth returns, it rarely seeks pyrotechnics. It knocks politely, and then it sits to wait, patient as a saint, until men choose whether to answer. There remains, after all this, a human element I cherish, the small acts of reattunement that follow consequence. My son and I returned to fragile conversations. He helped me paint the back porch in June, his hands awkward at first with the brush. He made me tea the way I had taught him years ago, neither too hot nor too heavy. The mason jar sat on the sill where I could see the street, its coins clinking like a small hymn. He attended meetings at the charity, not as a man of posture, but as someone learning humility. The public apology he offered in a written statement did not erase the night I found my life on the doorstep, but it was something, public acknowledgement that he had failed me in the most intimate way. For me, that acknowledgement mattered more than the returned money. It was the retrieval of my name from the ledger of convenience. The moral is not complicated. We teach our children with stories and hands. When they forget, when they choose the gleam of polish over the warmth of the kitchen, consequences will gather like a slow, steady tide. But justice, when pursued with patience and principle, brings not only restitution, but the chance for repair. There is dignity in being old and stubborn and right. If my story touched you, if it warmed you like a small fire on a cold evening, then do me a favor. Share it with someone who needs courage. Subscribe if you like, because an old heart has many more truths to tell. Comment with your own stories. How did you reclaim what you thought lost? And let us keep, together, the law of kindness in our hands. I will tell you one final secret before I close, because stories must have an ending that is honest. I kept the chipped mug. It sits on my kitchen shelf, a little hairline crack that I sometimes run my thumb over when I think of the nights I worried. It is not merely a vessel. It is a witness. It tells me every morning that I survived in dignity with patience and that we can stitch a life back together with small, stubborn things. The mason jar sits beside it, and when the coins sing, I remember that the sound was never about money. It was about savings for the next bus, for the next visit, for the next story to tell.